Hi guys, it's Jason here, and this is our first video looking at definitions of abnormality. So our unit, as you know, is mental health this term. Definitely with these videos, make sure you're taking notes. Pause when I tell you to pause to do the little activities. And we need to kick things off by first of all looking at how do we decide what is good mental health and bad mental health? How do we decide when somebody has an issue or a disorder and when they don't? So we've got to look at the definitions of abnormality, or what is abnormal behavior? How do we tell when somebody potentially has a mental health issue? Before we get started, I just want to do an activity off the bat, get you in the zone, get you thinking. This is a crazy picture, I know, but I want you to list what is abnormal in this picture. And there's a lot. I'll get you to pause it in a second and just brainstorm for 2 minutes everything that you can see here that you think is abnormal. Okay, pause the video now and write down as much as you can. Okay, hopefully you've got a pretty good list there. What I'd like you to do now is for each thing on your list, give a reason why it might actually be fine. I'm sure there's a perfectly justifiable reason for all of the things that you just wrote down. Pause the video again and see if you can come up with a legitimate reason why all of the things that you had just written down are actually totally normal. So hopefully what you have found is that context is really important here, right? There's a lot of crazy things happening in that picture, but without us understanding the context, we don't really know whether those things are symptomatic of a mental health issue or not. They look abnormal, but if you're coming up with reasons why they might actually be fine, well, they might actually be fine. Once you know the context, or you can take a guess at some context, it transforms your way of seeing things. So that's something to keep in mind through all of this. General questions that we're going to be looking at over the course of the whole term, really, these are some of the big themes, but specifically today, abnormal compared to what? Isn't everyone abnormal in different ways and normal in other ways? And who gets to decide what's normal and what is not? Is it psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, society in general? So how do we kind of label certain behaviors as normal or abnormal? And how does that help us if we're trying to do this in the context of mental health and mental illness? So it's not as simple as just giving a definition. Lots of psychologists have had lots of different ideas about how we should determine abnormality in regards to mental health and mental illness. What I'm going to take you through now is basically 6 different ways, 6 different definitions that all have their pros and cons. So here are the 6 definitions that I will take you through. I'm going to go through each of these in detail in a minute, so don't worry too much about this yet. But you might notice that the 3 on the left have kind of alternative names. That's just for your reference. If you're looking into this later on and you see it referred to something else, well, there you go. You know that it's actually the same thing. So the first definition we're going to look at is statistical deviation. And this is pretty straightforward. Frequently occurring behavior is normal. Rare behavior equals abnormal. So this definition says that if people are in the minority and their behavior is statistically rare, then they're abnormal. So an example might be something like joining the Nazi youth. Most people don't do that. It's statistically rare. So that might be a sign that there's an issue. It's a pretty simple definition though. Most of these kind of psychometric tests would just plot results, and we might have a bell curve or something like that that says the people on either end, or the people that are in the minority, are the ones more likely to have an issue because they're not behaving the same way that the majority are statistically. So there are some issues with that. When is a minority behavior actually a beneficial thing? Stop and think for a sec here. When is a minority behavior actually a beneficial thing? So you might have just thought about something like intelligence or even happiness. Okay, the most highly intelligent people in the world are obviously in the vast minority. It's a pretty rare thing, but you wouldn't say that it's abnormal or symptomatic of a mental health issue. In most cases, it would just be a statistically rare characteristic of that person. Same thing with happiness. Actually, the truly happy people in the world are in the minority, sad as that is. But you wouldn't say that they have any kind of issue either. And also, some minority behaviors are advantageous, useful, or even normal at certain times. So we look at the bell curve there and we can see that sometimes people sitting on either end of that bell curve, maybe they deviate statistically from the norm, from the majority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an issue. Our second definition here is social norm violation. And this is basically deviating from the implicit rules that society has about how we should act. So something that goes against the norms of the society that the individual is in is potentially a sign of a mental health issue, of abnormality. So an example here, pretty ridiculous one, but if somebody turned up to an office job in Elizabethan attire, you'd be like, okay, that's odd. Is that person okay? Or if you spotted someone having a shower in the civic fountain, without the deeper context, you might say that that's a bit of a violation of social norms. That's not what most people would expect. It's not in the kind of, unwritten rules of the way that we live. I've got a picture of Britney Spears there. When she was kind of at the peak of her pop stardom, she shaved her head, which definitely deviated from the social norms for, young female pop stars. And a lot of people started asking questions about whether or not there were deeper issues, whether she was maybe in a bit of a mental health crisis. So what issues would we have with this situation? Social norm violation. When would this not apply? Have a think for a sec. What about multicultural societies like ours? The social norms are different for different groups of people. My culture, my background, my family have a different set of social norms to maybe the German couple that live across the street or the Indian family that's down the road. So context is really important, once again, in determining whether a behavior deviates from social norms and whether that's something to be worried about. So let's say you see someone dressed as a banana. You'd be like, that's abnormal, that's unusual. But context is really important. What about if you then learned that you spotted them in Woden Plaza and that out on the street they were just having a big festival, some kind of, healthy living festival. There were a whole bunch of people dressed as fruit as part of the parade. You'd be like, okay, well, maybe they just haven't gotten changed yet, and it wouldn't seem abnormal at all. So just because an individual doesn't conform doesn't mean that they have a mental illness either. Individuals have the right to be different, and in our culture, we kind of prize individuality. So that's another issue here. Just because an individual doesn't conform, it doesn't mean that they have a mental illness. Our next definition here is personal distress. When a person experiences emotional distress or emotional pain while engaging in a particular behavior or a pattern of behavior, that might be our best sign that there's an issue. So, for example, if being the way that you are upsets you, well, then that's probably the best sign that maybe something is wrong. Good example of this might be something like obsessive compulsive disorder, where the person is compulsively washing their hands. It's not fun for them. They're finding that distressing. They don't like the way that they are. And that is obviously a key indicator that there's a mental health issue and that the person might need support. However, that doesn't apply to all abnormal behavior. Can you think of a classic example here where the person with the mental health issue does not experience any personal distress? Here's a bit of a clue. So if you haven't twigged yet, this is John Wayne Gacy Jr., incredibly famous, notorious American serial killer. And I mean, you can see in the police photo there, he's not experiencing any personal distress about his actions. But I don't think you could possibly deny the fact that he has some kind of mental health issue. The way that he behaved, the murders that he committed, show that he clearly has a mental issue. Okay? He's a psychopath, among other things, but he's not experiencing personal distress at his behavior at all. But we'd still call him in need of help or support or mental health treatment. Our next definition here is maladaptive behavior. So there are two aspects to this. It might either be maladaptive to one's self, which might mean an inability to reach your goals or adapt to the demands of your life, or it might be maladaptive to society, meaning it disrupts the social group and how people are able to behave and function. So maladaptive basically just means not adaptive. It means you're not able to deal with daily life because of the behavior. So an example here might be obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is actually different from obsessive compulsive disorder. I'll chat to you guys about the differences later. Another example, maybe a better one actually, is something like major depression, where the person can't get out of bed, they can't get to work, they don't feel motivated to do the things they need to do. Those are maladaptive behaviors that are stopping them from getting on with their lives effectively. And that might be our best signal that there's something abnormal happening and that the person might need some help with their mental health. Maladaptive behavior includes behavior that may initially help a person cope but has harmful effects. So an example here might be stress. So once again, what issues do you think are going to pop up here? In which situations might it be totally normal to behave in a maladaptive way? So if you look down the bottom there, I've written that sometimes behaving normally is actually abnormal. For example, the death of a relative. If a close relative died and you or somebody you know kept behaving normally, you might think that something was wrong, right? In that situation, unusual behavior like grieving and struggling with daily life and to get things done is actually pretty acceptable. So in this context, abnormal behavior or maladaptive behavior is pretty normal. And so we've got to, once again, keep the context in mind. Okay, our next one, this is our fifth definition, is deviation from an ideal. The idea that mentally healthy people possess certain characteristics, and that maybe the best way to tell if somebody is not mentally healthy is to identify a lack of one or many of these characteristics. So maybe a lack of autonomy or independence, or a lack of self-esteem, or something like that. So what issues could you see here? Can you think of a classic example of when somebody doesn't necessarily have those perfect characteristics, but you wouldn't call them abnormal? You wouldn't say that they have a mental illness. So what about a self-deprecating comedian? That's a classic example that kind of pops into my head. A lot of comedians kind of put themselves down. They might make fun of their weight or their ethnicity or any other kind of aspect, personal characteristic. But you wouldn't say that just because they show a lack of self-esteem in their comedy that they necessarily have a mental health issue. It might be a part of their identity and a part of their profession and nothing more than that. Our last definition here is medical disorder. So this is the most straightforward, a diagnosis of a biologically identifiable condition. So the neurologist says you have a tumor. It's the most scientific and indisputable way to define what's abnormal. The obvious issue here is that many mental health issues are not easily identifiable with medical or scientific testing, at least at the moment. That might change in the future, but we wouldn't say that, somebody is totally fine if they're behaving in ways that are blatantly, obviously not okay. We wouldn't say that they're totally fine just because the CAT scan came back and said that their brain doesn't look any different to anybody else's. So you can see here we've got 6 definitions, and all of them kind of have issues or situations, contexts where they don't quite work. But hopefully what you see is a few key themes emerging. And I think those key themes fall under 3 basic brackets. We've got the person being distressed by their behavior or their thoughts. We've got behavioral issues that might inhibit their ability to function normally in society. And we've got social dysfunction, things that show that they're not quite in touch with other people and what's expected of them and how to behave appropriately. So between those three, we might end up with a bit of a clearer picture of the major kind of alarm bells or warning signs that somebody might have a mental health issue or might be going through a bit of a mental health crisis. So then our final definition might look something like that first paragraph. Any pattern of behavior that causes an individual significant distress, causes them to harm themselves or others, or harms their ability to function in daily life. And we're kind of looking for maybe a couple of those things to be happening. Clinical psychologists would consider several different criteria in determining whether or not a pattern of behavior was abnormal or whether it was something that needed support or was symptomatic of a disorder. At least two of those things above would probably need to be met to form a diagnosis. So that leads us to the final concept for today, which is the idea of the 4 Ds of abnormality. This is a nice way to sum up what to look for when we're trying to decide whether or not somebody's behavior is abnormal and therefore cause for concern. So the 4 Ds are this. We've got danger, which is basically is the way that they're behaving, thinking, talking, putting themselves or other people in danger. Then we've got distress. Is the behavior personally distressing for that person, or is it causing significant distress to others? Then we've got deviance. Does the behavior deviate significantly from the person's normal behavior, from the social norms, or what's kind of expected, or what would be considered acceptable? And then the last one there is dysfunction. Is the behavior inhibiting the person's ability to function and get on with life and be effective and meet the demands of, day-to-day living? So between those 4 Ds, danger, distress, deviance, and dysfunction, we should be able to get a pretty clear picture of whether or not the behavior is abnormal and therefore symptomatic of a mental health issue. Okay, I hope you guys have found that useful and you've stuck with me. So we've got 6 definitions that we looked at initially. Whether or not the behavior is statistically rare and therefore may be a sign that there's a problem, whether it deviates from the social expectations and whether that might be a sign that the person is experiencing a mental health issue, whether it's personally upsetting for the person who's going through it, whether their behavior is maladaptive, whether what's happening is kind of getting in the way of them functioning in daily life, whether the behavior shows a deviation from maybe the characteristics we would expect from an ideally kind of mentally healthy person, and finally, whether there's a clear scientific, medically diagnosed issue or abnormality that would tell us that there's a problem. So all of those have got positives and all of those have got issues. The common themes with all of those kind of lead us to the 4 Ds of abnormality: danger, distress, deviance, and dysfunction. Hopefully you guys have taken something away from that. Make sure you check out both videos this week and do your Psych 5 checklist, and I'll see you in the video conference. Thanks, guys.